Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Monge. I'm a public policy officer at the Colorado Health Foundation, and I have the honor of facilitating some of today's meetings, but really I'm just here like you all to learn and from this wonderful group of presentations and panelists we have today. So thank you for joining us today. This is the third webinar in the Reimagining Housing Solutions series, and we're so grateful that you set aside time for this today. We truly hope it's an engaging 2 hours for you. You'll see on the screen the agenda that we have set for today. And before I get started, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the series sponsors who have truly been, this has truly been a group effort and lift, and it's been wonderful to work with such an engaged group of sponsors willing to give their time and their distribution list and help shape the content of the series. So as you can see on the screen, this includes Project Moxie, CHAFA, Colorado Municipal League, Colorado Counties, Inc., Housing Colorado, Enterprise, the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, and the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. So thank you, sponsors. I know many of you are here today with us, so thank you again for your partnership. So as you are aware, since you're here, today is the third of a 6-part series. We're halfway there. And you can see the dates and the themes for the remaining Reimagining Housing Solutions series webinars. This webinar this series has been really designed to build on top, one session build on top of the next. And so we hope that you all have been with us for the previous 2 and will join us for the last 3 this summer. So today's session, as you see on the screen, is focused on the role of housing policy and land use and housing strategy. So let's go through a little bit of housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, not a meeting, but a webinar format. So your cameras have been turned off and your audio has automatically been muted. Please use the chat function to submit any questions or, about the way the webinar is running or any technical difficulties. We'll be saving some time at the end of today's session, as we have done previously, for a Q&A period. So as questions arise for you, if you could use that Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, it will say it's down below with participants next to chat. If you could use the Q&A function and go ahead and put your question into that box that pops up when you click on it, anytime throughout the presentations as a question pops in your mind. No need to hold on to them till the end. We don't want you to forget it. And then we will do our best to quickly answer all of them, either right there or with the panel at the end. If we don't get to all of them today, which I'm guessing we will have some leftover questions, we will also be happy to follow up in an email next week with answers to the questions that we didn't get to today. One final item, today's webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded, and it will live on the series website that is housed currently on the Health Foundation's webpage. We can put a link to that in the chat, but you will get an email as a registrant next week with the follow-up questions and a link to where the recording lives, and the presentation will also be on that webpage. And then one more item, Zoom invites for the next series in June will be sent out in the next week or 2. So watch your inboxes for that. It comes directly from Zoom. So before we launch into the presentations, I just wanted to give a real quick background to the Health Foundation since we're helping run this series. I think some of you are very familiar with us, and we might be new to a great deal of you, which is fabulous. And so just a little background, the Health Foundation works to bring health within reach for all Coloradans by engaging closely with communities across the state through investing, which is our grant making, policy advocacy, learning, and capacity building. We use these tools to help improve health equity of the lives of those around the state who have low income or continue to have historically less power and privilege. We're a bit unique at the foundation in that we have a dedicated policy team that I have the privilege to work on that works very closely with our grant making team to further our strategic priorities, one of which relates to today is an affordable housing strategy. And specifically, we have a goal of reducing the number of households living below 80% of AMI who are spending over 30% of their income on housing. So we really want to bring affordable housing in reach for folks who need it the most in communities. And we want people to be able to stay and live in the community of their choice. One quick shameless plug while I have an amazing captured audience here today. the Health Foundation believes in listening first, and that's why a few years ago we launched what we call the Pulse Poll. It's a statewide public opinion poll that takes stock of items around, or public opinion around the cost of living, lack of affordable housing, access to healthcare, mental well-being. It really takes the pulse on Coloradans on a wide range of important health issues year to year. So we have some data that spans from year after year. And we released the full data set for this public opinion poll. It lives on a website that I'll put in the chat after this presentation. And it's accessible to anybody. And we want you all to really use that data as it's helpful to you and to filter and learn more about the opinions of folks in your community through this data. We are going to do a series of kind of breakdowns on the data by topic. And the first one happens to be around the cost of housing and living, so appropriate for this group today. And so we wanted you to save the date. And again, I'll put this in the chat for Tuesday, May 24th at 11 a.m. till 12. And there'll be a registration link on the website, the Pulse website, and we hope you can join us for that. But then the recording will also live on our website. So anyway, that's enough about the foundation, and I will put that website in if you all are interested. And let's go ahead and get today's session started. We like to just engage you right before we launch into information overload and kind of get a sense of what you all are thinking as it relates to the topic. So today we have a Zoom poll for you that should have just shown up on your screen. In your opinion, how aligned are your current zoning and land use policies with the visions and needs of your community? We're forcing you to choose a single choice, although we know that it's probably fairly nuanced, and you might want to check several. So we'll give you about 30 seconds to make sure we get them all in. Just curious what you all think about your zoning and land use policy. Just a light topic for this Friday.
Matt, did we hit record yet?
We did. We are on the recording.
It's Friday.
I appreciate the double check.
All right, I think we have most of your answers, so it should pop up somewhat aligned. It looks like it's in the lead at 60%, followed by, I'm not sure, I need to learn more, and then followed by not aligned, and then in last place, very aligned, which is actually not surprising and kind of supported our hunch. So we hope you all learn a great deal today, and I'm going to turn over the presentation now to the experts. Thanks again for being here.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. My name is Charlie Brennan. I'm the Deputy Director of Research at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. And I'm here today as part of this panel to discuss a little bit about the current legislation that's going through the legislature right now related to affordable housing. $400 million in ARPA funds that the state received are being allocated this legislative session to different housing priorities. And then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and some context of zoning and other housing practices in the past that have really led us in some ways to this point that we're at today. And hopefully that will be a good segue into some of the other topics that we'll discuss as part of this presentation. So as I mentioned, Colorado allocated $400 million in ARPA funds, or American Rescue Plan Act funds, in 2021. Over the course of last summer and then into the beginning of this year, a bipartisan legislative task force was responsible for looking at sort of the state of housing and affordable housing in Colorado, and then coming up with some recommendations about how that funding should be allocated to different programs. The two biggest programs that came out of that in terms of funding were a grant program and a revolving loan fund program. So the grant programs, there's two of them now, are part of HB 1304. And then the revolving loan fund was part of Senate Bill 159. And the grant programs, unlike the revolving loan fund program, will repeal at the end of December of 2026. That's when all ARPA funds need to be spent or they go back to the US Treasury Department. I'll also note, because there's different AMI criteria for eligible projects associated with each of these different projects, that these AMI definitions are not meant to define affordable housing statewide or for all programs at the state. These are just for these specific programs. And there's a lot of more details that I'm sure you'll want to hear about that we don't know exactly about yet. So once this legislation is signed by the governor, which it looks like it will be, both of these two bills, the Department of Local Affairs and the different divisions that are responsible for administering these programs will have a period of time over the summer where they'll really develop a lot of the fine print of sort of how these programs will work, how communities can apply for them, and some of the selection criteria that they'll use to determine who gets funding. Next slide, please. So the first bill, HB 1304, includes two different grant programs. The first program is the Transformational Affordable Housing Grant Program, and that will have attached to it an allocation of $138 million of the ARPA funds that we received. And this is a program that's only open to local governments and nonprofit organizations. The money can be used, or the grant funding can be put towards a range of different activities related to affordable housing. There's a lot more than this spelled out in the bill. I just wanted to give just sort of a sense of the breadth of all the different uses that this can go to, from infrastructure to building new housing to rehabilitating old housing, really with the goal of just, doing everything we can to expand the supply of affordable housing in Colorado. And below you'll see there's different AMI limits or AMI eligibility criteria for projects. They're different based on both the tenure types, so whether they're rental or homeownership projects, and based on the location. So urban, rural, and rural resort counties are designations that DOLA or the Department of Local Affairs will develop over the course of the summer. And it's spelled out in the bills that communities or counties, if they aren't satisfied with the designation that they receive, can work with DOLA to come up with a designation that's more appropriate for their community. The next grant program that's part of 1304 is the Infrastructure and Strong Communities Grant Program. This is a much smaller grant program relative to the first one, but still has a sizable amount of funding attached to it. And this is a program that's only available to local governments and really is used and intended to be used for infrastructure projects that then allow for infill or redevelopments in a downtown area or a CBD or around transit. Since that's not necessarily a context that every community in the state has, DOLA is directed to give flexibility to rural communities to address local needs, as long as it's, the use of the funds is compatible with the overall goal, which is, by and large, expanding the supply of affordable housing. And it will also be used, this funding, for education and technical assistance programs. Again, there's different AMI eligibility criteria for the projects for this funding source. And they're different for each of these different programs, which is a little confusing. I'm not entirely sure how that came about, but it is what it is. Next slide, please. So the last bill is Senate Bill 159, which establishes the Transformational Affordable Housing Revolving Loan Fund. This is the largest of the three programs, with $150 million of ARPA funds allocated towards it. And this is a program that will be open to anybody, essentially, that's involved in the production or construction of housing. So local governments, for-profit developers, and then community and nonprofit, as well as any sort of political subdivision of the state. It's intended to provide flexible, low interest and below market loans. Beyond that, there's not a lot of details. That's sort of yet to be worked out, I think, over the course of the summer. And the uses are very similar to the first grant program. But really, I think that the intent or the idea here is that really this would be a good source or a source for LIHTC or low income housing tax credit projects, state affordable housing tax credit projects, other projects to draw from for gap financing to sort of make projects feasible that maybe wouldn't be with the existing sources of funding that are available. And again, a different set of AMI requirements or eligibility requirements attached to this bill. And just as a general update, 1304 has passed through both houses, both the House and the Senate. And so, in theory, it should be on its way to the governor's desk for him to sign. SB 159 is currently being heard in the House on third reading, which means that's the last time it gets heard, the last time they vote on it before it either moves on to the governor's desk or doesn't. It looks like this one will. Expect to hear more about these programs in the coming days as the legislative session wraps up, which it should next week. And so that's just a brief overview of some of the programs, affordable housing programs that are, that communities like yourselves will be able to take advantage of in the coming years, and we really encourage and hope that folks do and start thinking now about how they can use that funding or what projects that funding might be able to be used for. With that said, I now want to move on to sort of looking at the history and sort of the context in which we find ourselves today as it relates to zoning and land use policy and housing policy. So this is a list of a range of different discriminatory and exclusionary housing policies that have been in place in this country at some point. Some are still here today and others have been ruled illegal. I think really what I'm hope to do with this list, this isn't exhaustive by any means, but really just show that throughout the past 100 years, 120 years, there's been a range of different policies and programs intended to limit or direct where different people or different types of housing can be located in our communities. Many of these policies, didn't work on their own. They often work hand in hand to really exacerbate and intensify the effects that they had on perpetuating segregation and different patterns of concentrations of low income folks in our communities. For instance, the GI Bill, which was a bill that was intended to provide a range of things, but among them cheap housing or cheap mortgages and loans for returning veterans. That for veterans of color, they often ran into issues because, even though they had sort of support through the GI Bill, if they were able to, it was very difficult also, but if they were able to, then they could run into issues with, redlining, where they were denied a mortgage loan because they lived in a certain neighborhood. I'll also note that some of these programs, while they have great intentions and actually do a lot of good in the community and the communities in which they're available in, they still can have unintended consequences that we should be aware of and be thinking about. So for instance, the low income housing tax credit project, by many measures is one of the most, if not the most successful affordable housing project or affordable housing program in our country. However, studies have shown that this type of housing that's built through the low income housing tax credit projects tend to be located in areas where there's a high concentration of poverty, there's sort of a lack of access to opportunity, different services, good schools, et cetera. And so really can reinforce patterns of segregation in our communities. And this is true not only in sort of urban areas like Denver, but even in more rural areas that receive funding through the LIHTC program. And now I want to turn to one program in particular, one policy in particular, which was redlining. I think redlining is a helpful policy to look at to understand sort of how these policies, both influenced the development of our cities in the past, but also the way our cities look now, because it's so spatial and geographic because of the redlining maps that were created. So redlining, just in a simple sense, is a practice of denying credit or mortgages to a family, a household based on where they live. And the justification for that is that, there's this idea that people that live in certain parts, certain neighborhoods are more risky to lend to. And this practice was really formalized in the 1930s in the United States by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This was a New Deal agency created in the 1930s. And really one of the things that they did that was most impactful in sort of implementing or formalizing redlining as a practice was to create the HOLC maps. And these were color-coded maps of different communities across the country that rated neighborhoods based on the perceived riskiness. And so, this was often determined based on sort of the age and conditions of housing in neighborhoods, but there was a large influence related to whether there was the presence of religious, racial, or ethnic minorities living in a particular neighborhood. And even though this practice of redlining is formally illegal in the United States, it was since the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there still are signs or imprints of this policy in our communities today. So, research shows that, across the country, people that live in high-risk neighborhoods or that were high-risk neighborhoods on these HOLC maps still tend to be relatively lower income or more diverse than the community that surrounds them. Residents also today are still denied mortgages at higher rates, despite this practice formally being illegal in the United States. And so I think it really shows that even though we had a policy in the past that no longer exists today, we're still feeling the impacts and the implications of that policy. And this was no different in Denver. So Denver had an HOLC map created. Pueblo also did, which we'll see in a little bit here. But I think what this map shows is you can really see just how clearly the community was segregated into different groups. And, this is for each of the different neighborhoods, there was a specific little description that was created that really described sort of the conditions and sort of the features for why it received whatever rating it did. So for this area that, is now in present day, sort of 5 Points neighborhood, we can see the description, that was occupied by a combination of Negroes, Mexicans, and a transient class of workers. It seems from this description that there probably was a prevalence of renters in these neighborhoods. And these maps are very explicit about, sort of how they felt about different racial or ethnic minorities living in different neighborhoods. You can see in the description of detrimental influences, they refer to Negro and foreigners living in these areas as an infiltration. So sort of something that, we need to protect against and sort of defend ourselves against. So, really sort of explicitly baking into this fabric of our communities, this sort of segregation. And so question this map is from 1933. So this was developed during the Great Depression, during the New Deal era. And when we look at the socio-demographic and economic characteristics of Denver's neighborhoods today, we can still see the influences of this policy. So there's sort of a pattern that's called the Denver L here. It's sort of this, you can sort of see it diagrammed in that red upside down L. And really it's meant to denote sort of the areas of Denver that have sort of different characteristics from the rest of the city. So that there's more people of color, people tend to have lower levels of education. There's less sort of community investment. So trees is sort of just a proxy for that. And people in these areas are more likely to be displaced. And just quickly, here's Pueblo's HOLC map. To my knowledge, I think this is the only other community that had an HOLC map created. There could be more, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Next slide. Excuse me. So when we look at zoning today, we can still see that there are implications or impacts in terms of the spatial patterns of where different people live, not only by race and ethnicity, which we see here, but as we'll see later, based on economic characteristics as well. So these are two different studies. I just wanted to highlight some of these charts from, because I think they're really interesting and really do show the relationship between single-family zoning and exclusion, and sort of why single-family zoning is often referred to as exclusionary zoning. So as you can see, these studies are looking at, by the Othering and Belonging Institute from the University of California at Berkeley, the different sort of characteristics of cities in the Bay Area, as well as in the Los Angeles area, ranked by their single-family zoning at the bottom, and then the racial composition on the other axis. And as you can see, as we move from no single-family zoning to 100% single-family zoning, some real changes in terms of the demographic characteristics. Far more white residents living in communities that have 75% or more single-family zoning. And these really are meant to just show sort of the impacts, the effects of sort of these policies, sort of as they've been in place over time. They're not supposed to, not meant to sort of represent a causative relationship. So in other words, if a community were to reduce their single-family zoning from 100 to 50, they wouldn't necessarily see an influx of people of color. That's just sort of capturing the relationship that we see today. And we can also see this relationship again when we look at statistics like the median household income, the median home value. This is just looking at communities in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. And as you can see, again, as we move from less single-family zoning to more single-family zoning, an increase in both, the wealth and the higher income folks living in those communities. And then again, in terms of home values. And I think the home values one is an interesting relationship because if we think about single-family zoning, it really, on its face is one of the least land efficient uses in terms of units per acre that we create in our communities. And so really it's a tool to sort of limit in some ways the availability of housing in a community, or it can be, whether intentionally or not. And so I think we can see here, this relationship is that, as land and housing is more scarce in some of these, wealthier, higher income communities, that we see a corresponding change in the home prices. And this is my final slide here. Really, and this is a little bit, takes a little bit of looking at for it to sort of sink in, but here it's showing the link between childhood outcomes and the prevalence of single family zoning in the community in which that child grew up. So this is combining data from their study as well as from the Opportunity Atlas. The authors from the OBI were able to show that, regardless of the parent's income, which is what those different lines represent, sort of the percentile of the parent's income, the child's income, regardless of that, is much greater as an adult if they grew up in a community that had a higher percentage of single family zoning. And so really, I think what this chart suggests is that there's a link. This is what the authors argue as well. There's a link between single family zoning and access to opportunities. Children, regardless of their income, if you're lucky enough to be born in a community that has a high share of single family zoning, at least in the Los Angeles area, your outcomes as an adult were much better in terms of your ultimate household income. And with that, I want to turn it over to Clark, who's going to go over a little bit more about the housing policies that communities have available to them and how it can relate to their housing goals.
Thanks, Charlie. Good to be with everybody today. Thanks for your interest in this important conversation, and thanks for everybody for organizing. We can dive in. I'm going to be talking about, how do we take some of what Charlie just set, really a fantastic context for, and think about, okay, well, how do we do a better job? How do we actually plan for great communities, livable places, in a way that we create more housing choice, more housing opportunity, and more affordability? And, Colorado is a fast growing place. So we also know we have to think of that in the context of how we're growing. And we know that the politics of that are challenging. And so sort of thinking about how do we do this in a way that's better than what we've been doing, and also really moves the needle in these areas is a critical question. And one of the things we have to remember when we think about that is we want to be moving towards creating a more balanced market as we move forward, because a lot of our markets are very badly out of balance. And so that's about how do we expand choice and opportunity and affordability for different income levels by the different types of housing and levels of housing in terms of affordability that we can provide. So I think it's useful to sort of think first about what's not working when we look at the current system. And in a way, this sort of starts to visualize a lot of the things that Charlie was just talking about. And if we start unraveling this system, or at least a couple pieces of it, it's easier to sort of think about how we weave it back together. And so we know in our current system, we have zoning and infrastructure policies and a lot of other parts of the system that really limit the housing choices that we have. And so it's this idea of having a very really exclusionary type of housing, and even beyond that idea, which is a very powerful idea, just limiting the types of choices in terms of what we've been building. And we've been building so much single family over many decades that we often lack more diverse types that different parts of our community need, so that we can have a more balanced market that provides different points of entry. Also, as we look at our current sort of policy framework, and again, we'll break this down a little bit more in a minute, but what we see on the ground is places that are pretty separated and segregated and disconnected, right? And that's just a legacy of the classic Euclidean zoning structure, where we orient things around uses, and we put some uses over here and some uses over there. And you can see it here in a more rural context and previously in a more urban context. But what you end up with is places that are not well connected, where certain people get to live in certain places, and also certain uses, residential versus commercial, are in different places. And that does create communities that are themselves not well connected, as opposed to creating neighborhoods where things are more mixed together and you can have a more diverse variety of housing in those neighborhoods. We also see from, again, this same system, that the location of where we grow, and particularly where we think about where housing is located, it's not working well. This is from the county I grew up in, Eagle County. This is, quote unquote affordable housing in the west part of the county in Cerro. And this is a long distance away from the job. So it represents that classic imbalance between housing and jobs that we have in a lot of our markets. And yeah, this product is more affordable, but it is locationally very disconnected from any communities. People are driving farther. And it's just one example of the ways that we tend to locate housing, in particular, housing that's more affordable in places that really aren't core in our communities. And Charlie mentioned that even within the context of LIHTC projects. And there's just a lot of examples about the way that we cite new development, and particularly more affordable housing, in a way that really doesn't lead to equitable outcomes, and it exacerbates this larger system. And I know it's interesting to sort of tie transportation into this, but when you have sort of the more far-flung locations of housing and development connected to the sort of separated places that we've created and the lack of choice, you end up only being able to tie all those things together with an auto-oriented transportation system that we all know is really expensive and hard to maintain. And that matters for housing. You can keep going because the system itself is very inefficient and makes it really hard to build more diverse housing choices. And when we do, and we try to create denser product, for example, it tends to not feel connected into a place or a community, but instead surrounded by drive aisles and lots of on-street parking. You can keep going. And then that too is kind of the critical piece of the transportation system that we've created, is it really relies on a lot of parking to make it work. And we're going to talk more in depth about that. So when we add these pieces together, we get a system and a pattern that has a lot of problems for a lot of reasons, but certainly one of them is housing. And for us to be able to unravel this system and start building a new one, we have to kind of look at these things and say, okay, well, how can we do some things better? So as we look at a better way forward, I mean, one of the things we want to do is look at ways to expand the choices that are available for communities. And you can just move through these pretty quick, Matt. And one of the areas where there's a lot of work, and this isn't the only space, but just making sure that we make it possible to build the more diverse housing types that sort of sit between traditional single family and your mid-rise or high-rise residential. And we've gotten pretty good at building on either side of that barbell, but in a lot of communities, we've made it very difficult through current development standards to be able to build the more diverse sort of prototypes of housing that you have in here, everything from fourplexes to different types of townhomes. And you guys are aware of this. We'll get more into the details of this, but legalizing these missing middle housing types is one piece we can do. We also have to really think about where we're growing and how to get location right. It matters a lot. And too often when it comes to planning for housing or actually establishing the policy for housing, we don't do a good enough job of saying, of zoning like we mean it in terms of the location. And we need to do a better job of saying, these are the places that are going to transition, where we're going to encourage new housing. And we're not only going to sort of lay that out in our plans and our vision, we're going to make sure it carries through all the way to policy, and we're going to make the supportive investments in infrastructure and what have you to make it possible to actually do that. And we need to think about that both in terms of infill and redevelopment, growing smarter at the edge, which for a lot of communities is really important because we are sort of land scarce in many communities. So think about, how do we grow at the edge in a way that doesn't exacerbate some of the system that we already looked at, connecting to transit and so on. And so there again, coming back to the transportation side of it, we can, when we're thinking about land use policy and more broadly transportation policy, support housing by building a well-connected transportation system. So this is here in Glenwood Springs, where I'm located. Having a connected grid like that is critical to creating neighborhoods that can adapt over time and accommodate different types of housing, including that missing middle variety that I talked about. And those types of connected streets and connected neighborhoods have the ability to accommodate changing densities over time and changing building types. And then when we knit that together with multimodal transportation choices, this is how we make it so that we can have people in different housing types and shape neighborhoods that are more affordable for people that also have the housing types that they need. And there's some cool places that are actually codifying this. There's a really cool community doing this through annexation policy and subdivision policy in Texas, where they've committed themselves to growing in a way that continually expands their grid, and they have some great connectivity policies. And there's other places doing this as well. When we do these things right, we start to create complete connected neighborhoods, which are inclusive places where we can have a mix of incomes and begin to build out that more balanced market that is more affordable, provides opportunity and choice for different people. And it's important to note that this doesn't mean we don't have to do the work of creating dedicated long-term affordable housing and working through different policy tools and funding mechanisms to do that. But even to do those types of really valuable and really critical moves, we need to make sure that the underlying land use and policy framework is there to support those types of places, and so that they fit into our neighborhoods, as opposed to continually being things that we thrust off to the side of our communities. So when we think about how we do these things and start to make this, system work, let's sort of unpack some of the tools. And it starts with, at the most basic level with your comprehensive plan. And a lot of you guys know this, but let's just sort of unpack the pieces. And your comprehensive plan is where you have your overarching vision that guides, where is the community trying to grow? What do we want that growth to look like? What types of places are we actually trying to create? And that's the stuff that's carried forward in your comprehensive plan. And it's sort of that broader community vision. And then you have more detailed sub-area or topical plans, which are a place where you can orchestrate that vision through opportunity sites, strategic infrastructure investments, and other types of moves that make it sort of localize that broader vision at the place level, at the neighborhood level, and really get it right and work with the community at that level to make the pieces come together in the right way. And then, of course, you can execute a lot of that through your capital improvement plan, through infrastructure investments that support the type of development that you want and really set the table for that. But there's also the policy layer we need to get into of your zoning. And so it's useful, I think, to sort of unpack the different pieces of this. Zoning codes are organized in different ways, and I'm not a guy who sits and writes zoning codes, so I won't pretend to be that. But we do help communities assess what isn't working in theirs, and let's just unpack some of the pieces of a typical zoning code and see what the elements are. You usually start with your map, and this provides the framework that takes your community vision and says, okay, well, this is what it's actually going to look like on the ground in our community. And it's usually organized into different districts. And ideally, those districts were moving away from a more exclusionary approach, where we sort of say, well, everything over here is R1 and it's all single family, and that's going to end up being 60 or 70% of the community. And everything over here is R2, and everything over here in the more sort of far flung part of the community, this will be where we'll do multifamily. And we're trying to move towards, thinking about zone districts more as a way of shaping places and clearly defining what types of places do we want. Now, inside your different districts, you're going to have the purpose and intent of each district, and that's going to talk about what types of places do we want, and that should clearly identify for developers and for the community. This is what we're hoping this place becomes or evolves into over time. And then related to that, you're going to have regulations around what's actually allowable uses. Then inside of that, you're going to have what's often called dimensional standards. So the basic sort of shaping of a particular project on a site. And you get into questions of, what are the setbacks and how tall can it be? And there's a lot of different ways that communities do that. And sometimes we have so many different ways of applying dimensional standards that it ends up having a bit of a Frankenstein response. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Parking regulations are another critical piece that ends up having a lot of impact. We'll talk more about that in a minute. There's a lot we can do within subdivision and annexation regulations as well, both for housing, but it's also just a piece of the puzzle. And then your fee structure is another space. Hannah's going to talk about that, I think. And then within our entitlement processes, there are things we can do to make it harder or easier. And so evaluating all those, but that's just, pulling apart the basic elements. I know this isn't the way everybody's is, but it attempts to sort of level set what are the main guts of a code. So, ideally we have a situation where we got a vision and we've got plans that really articulate that vision, and then policies that implement those plans. And then we're making strategic investments that realize all of it and help make it happen on the ground. But very often, these links are broken at different points. And we can see that in a lot of places. We're going to show some examples in a minute here. So, this is actually from a project we did where we asked people in the community, what's your favorite building in the downtown? And everybody loved this old historic building. And unfortunately, if it was to burn down tomorrow, you couldn't rebuild it next door or even in the same site, because of a variety of standards, but especially the height requirement wouldn't allow it. And so that's just one example where the vision for the community, which was already drawn below, was out of sync with what was actually allowed in local policy. So let's sort of break this down in an even more, sort of looking at all the pieces together kind of way. We'll do a little experiment here. You can keep going, Matt. So let's pretend I'm a developer in a town, and I've heard about some of this missing middle stuff, and I want to try to help build some housing choices in my community. And I've kind of figured out the area in town where I think it's probably a good idea, because I've looked and seen that in the intent statement for that district, they talk about having multifamily dwellings. And so I'm feeling like, okay, this is pretty good. So, I'm ready to go, and I'm going to dig into the code and see what I can do. Let's sort of see how this looks. But right away, I start to see some red flags. For one thing, the intent statement tells me that this is a place where we're trying to enable multifamily development, but it's actually not even a by right use. It's a conditional use. So that right there is my first red flag. I'm feeling a little bit nervous, but it's okay. Probably, at least it's listed as a conditional use, right? So let's keep going. So then I start digging in a little bit deeper, and I start thinking about the standards that are there. And I look at it and I say, okay, maximum height. Okay, I'm really limited here to 35 feet. I think we can probably do that. And then I start looking at these lot sizes. And at this point, I'm maybe wondering, whether or not it's my fourplex or not. I'm just thinking about, okay, wow, I have to have a full 5,000 square foot lot. That's pretty big. But if I want to get to that fourplex, I'm looking at getting to 7,500 square feet. That's a pretty big lot. Okay, so I'm almost at 2,000 square feet per unit. Minimum lot width is 50 feet. So I won't be able to use, if I was to try to do even just a single family project at some point on one of the more narrow 25-foot lots, I wouldn't be able to do that. Parking, 2 space per unit. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at 8 spaces. All right, and maximum lot coverage, 60%. So I need to figure out what to do with the other 40%. And then, wow, these setbacks. So when we start going into that, I start seeing the different red flags popping up in different places. And you can cruise through this, Matt. And this is where you just sort of do your initial scan, but it really starts to reveal when we start moving forward far enough to actually plop a project on a site. Go ahead. So now I've got my site here, and this is sort of, I'm actually working on the standard lot size. So luckily the standard lot size in here is pretty big. So I don't have to worry so much about the lot size here. I'm lucky there. I've got this sort of little bit of heartache around having my fourplex be conditional. So I'm going to have to, work through the process and may or may not make it through planning and zoning commission and have to go in front of council, but hopefully we can get a good project designed. So luckily the density works. I am allowed to build 4 units on the site, but let's go ahead and start pulling the setbacks back. And then we're going to go ahead and also pull the parking back. Dang it. Now it looks like once I do that and I put the setbacks in the parking, and because of the front setback, that's where my parking needs to go. So I'm going to end up having this pretty suburban feeling project that pushes everything into the back of the lot. And it's really not what I want. The form's pretty bad. And so from an affordability perspective, I can build it, it's feasible. And I can get 4 units at about 750 square foot each, but it could be better. And the form is really not very ideal. So let's see what else we can do. Let's try just experimenting with some different things. What if we shift things around a little bit and just reduce the parking by half a spot per unit, and that makes it easier now for me to actually fit the parking in the back. And then it also lets me bring things forward. And let's go ahead and experiment with maybe just pulling back a little bit on the setback requirements and pushing things a little bit forward. This is more of a traditional fabric or framework for a mixed use or missing middle neighborhood closer to the street. We're still at 20 feet, so it's still plenty of space there. But suddenly I'm able to build larger units that are going to offer different options for people. These still aren't super large units. I mean, this is still missing middle fourplex, but it's a much better form. Instead of having sort of single unit squaring the street like I had before, and then people having side access and kind of a funky delivery that way, we have really a building that's going to front the street and feel like a really good fit within even a single family or predominantly single family neighborhood. You know, the fourplex after is going to be a much better fit. So this is a great way to sort of test what your code can do, and a nice way to just see how you can actually gut check your code. And just taking an actual lot and a hypothetical project and playing it through is a good way to do that. We've actually got on our website, and I'll pop it in the chat, a tool called the Breaking the Code Toolkit that walks you through how to do this. So you can kind of, it tries to demystify code a little bit to make it easier to see how to do this. But one of the take homes for this too is just to see how the disconnect happens from the vision where we have the intent that says one thing down to the various little pieces that all seem well intentioned in the beginning, but when you stack them all together, it does get harder and harder to be able to pull something off. So I think that's my last slide, and I will hand it off.
Great. It's awesome to be with you all today. Just to share a little bit about myself, to kind of share my context. I ran a homeless shelter that built supportive housing and affordable housing in partnership with another nonprofit here in Denver. And now I work at Shopworks Architecture, where I get to sit on all of our affordable housing developments and homeless shelters, do a lot of work around trauma-informed design, which I know we're not talking about today, but always put that plug in there about how the built environment can think about the mental health needs of folks. And then I just kind of fill in some capacity in the affordable housing industry where we see some holes. And so one of the very strange projects I have taken on, I didn't know I was so passionate about parking. You can go to the next slide. But what I found is in doing a lot of post-occupancy evaluations of our affordable housing developments, I'd always walk through these like horrifically empty parking lots. And coupled that with the idea that in my job at Shopworks, we work with a lot of nonprofits and housing developers to just look at lots of plots of land like we just did with Clark to say, can we build housing here? What does that look like? And conservatively, 50% of our developments never made it past the visioning stage over parking. I didn't realize how important parking was until I sat there and noted that time and time again, parking got in the way of projects even becoming a real conversation. And I knew that I walked through all these empty parking lots in our affordable housing developments. And so I decided, because I'm a physics major and a geek at heart, to just do a study and look at the numbers and say, is my anecdotal experience real or not real? And what we found, we're based in Denver, but I'm going to also speak about rural communities later on in this, my short presentation. But what we found was so often code in Denver used to require at least 1.25 spaces per unit without thinking about the types of individuals, the type of housing, who's going to be in there. There's just an assumption that people have cars, and they applied it, you know, across the city. They shifted it sometimes depending on location, right? So things right on Colfax had a really low parking requirement. So if I was building supportive housing, right, for folks exiting homelessness close to Colfax, you know, we could play around with parking well, but in certain places, we'd have to, you know, do 1.25 parking spots per unit. And so next slide, in 2020, we dove deep into the research and just looked at 19 properties, about, you know, 1,300 apartments. And we really were focusing on any development that had happened across the Front Range that had supportive housing as a piece of it. because this was a really specific type of development that Shopworks does a lot of. And you can go to the next slide. And I'll be honest, the results astounded even me. We found that across all the affordable housing, about 1 in 4 apartments had a car attached to them. But when you looked at supportive housing, you know, again, we're building 1.25 parking spots per unit for these sometimes. And only 8-9%, if we want to round up, of folks moving into these units have a car, right? This is offensive. This is ridiculous, right? Well, we're building all this parking and we don't need it. We also found that the proximity to walking and biking, a lot of supportive housing, for example, offers transit passes, right? And they're placed near public transportation, as a lot of the requirements sometimes of kind of making sure that the folks who live in these buildings can access all that they need to. Next slide. And so, you know, so when we looked at kind of all of these spaces that were required, you know, and the Denver code had some notes that there was a percentage you could take off if you were building affordable housing. But even that, right? So we found zoning required 883 spaces for these 1,300 apartments, but only 461 of those units were used. And so we really, you know, and I will also say, like, what we found, right, was there was the code, and then there were these processes we could go for. We were going through the Board of Adjustment here in Denver for 2 of our projects. And we were working with a committee with really great intentions, but they don't know what it's like to walk alongside folks who are experiencing homelessness. They didn't understand their needs. And they were kind of denying our request to limit the parking because they're like, no, but like somebody just said to me, like, but how can somebody not own a car? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I don't even know where to start with you, right? So we have these great processes, but they're not actually following the vision of Denver, right? Which is to build more affordable housing, right? We're prioritizing parking over people, which is offensive. So next slide. And so, you know, it did really depend on the type of housing that was being built, right? Not location, as the Denver code that hadn't been updated in 12 years noted, right? They were thinking about what geographically, where in the city it mattered. And instead it's like, no, like actually families are more likely to have a car. Supportive housing are way less likely, right? Folks exiting homelessness, staying in shelters, right? Like, yeah, they don't have cars. As the AMI levels in these buildings went up, the parking needs also increased, right? But then as you think about transit and walkability, as you're more transit oriented, folks are less likely to have a car, right? This isn't rocket science. Next slide. I'll happily put in the chat a link to our parking study. I include all our data as an appendix, but here you can kind of see, right, like the parking that was built versus the parking that was used. And sometimes, you know, we're right on the money, right? Like Arroyo Village Workforce in the bottom, we were right on the money as to the amount of parking that needed to be built. But some of these, it's just absurd, the amount of parking that we've built versus that which is being used. Next slide. We also had some conversations. So we worked with Fox Tuttle Transportation. They've done this work as well to look at these rural communities. And yeah, folks in rural communities are often more likely to have a car, right? It's not an option not to in certain spaces. But not necessarily, right? And so really thinking about what this looks like. Next slide. I think the thing to me that's kind of the most offensive about parking, besides the fact that beautiful greenery just gets paved over, but really thinking about the cost to developments, right? When we have to build this much parking, it's not just an issue of land, it's an issue of the budget. And parking kills projects. And I understand, like, I try to ride my bike most days to work, right? I understand people drive cars, we need to plan for cars. But the moment that we're sitting there and we have these empty parking lots that cost, you know, a lot of money to build, to finance, and it's expensive, right? I mean, it makes financial models not work out for these developments. Next slide. And this really was what brought it home to me. So the projects that the developments that we were exploring, the housing, the apartments, were pretty relatively new buildings, right? So these developments came about over about 6 years. And in 6 years, just in the city of Denver, we spent $9.3 million on parking that was completely unnecessary. And this is just like, you know, the average cost per space, right? This doesn't always even account for the cost of that land. We could have built an entire new affordable housing building. And instead we built these really ugly parking lots. Next slide. And so kind of with that in mind, community planning and development was also thinking about this as a concept as well, because they were seeing how this was impacting these affordable housing developments that we as a city of Denver said are really important, but then our policies get in the way of that, right? To our poll at the beginning of this. And so we were actually able to shift the code in Denver. And so now for any development up to and including 60% AMI, the parking minimum is now 1 parking spot for every 10 units. And this is a minimum, right? And really what great conversations we had with CPD and the folks there, who I cannot speak highly enough of, was an acknowledgement that developers and those funding all of these developments are not gonna give money to a project, a development that does not include enough parking. And so instead of it going through all these processes and adding all this risk to a project, right? We can instead say the folks who are designing these buildings know the folks who are going to move into them, and they are going to right size the parking. Don't put it through these multiple committees that just don't get it and don't do supportive housing, right? This is the bread and butter for these nonprofits and developers that we work with. We had unanimous support from the planning board. We had support from DOLA, and had over kind of 70 organizations and businesses say like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. And it passed last summer, last June, it went into effect. And what's been great about it as well is it looks at land that can be like squirrely and allows affordable housing to be built in places that market rate housing couldn't build in. So it takes all these weird triangle sites and these like funky sites that you can kind of fit a couple parking spots, but not a whole parking lot, and allows us to use land that otherwise is undeveloped. Next slide. And so if you ever want to geek out over parking, I'm your gal. Weirdly not where I saw my life going, but you know, the universe likes laughing at all of us. You know, and I'll say too, I mean, this report, feel free to steal it. Feel free to ask me any questions. We used it in Ogden, Utah 2 days ago, and we're able to shift the parking down on a development there and get it through a necessary stage of the development process, right? And so let's think some better thoughts about parking. Let's build gardens. Let's build more units. Let's not build empty parking lots.
Laura, I'll geek out with you on that stuff all day long. So happy to be rounding out this group. Hannah Klausman, Assistant Director at the Community Development Department over here in Glenwood Springs. And we'll go to the first slide there. We can cruise past that nice little picture right into our Glenwood Springs overview. Some of you are probably very familiar with our community, small town of about 10,000, tourist destination for our hot springs, very geographically constrained, being in the mountains, so we don't have a lot of land left. We've done a regional housing study that, my gosh, is old at this point, but 2018 doesn't seem too long ago, that outlined some of our shortfalls that we've been chasing after since then. And just some fun facts for everyone following the housing market. You know, our average single family home sale price in 2021 hit about $770,000. And really where I wanted to kind of point out is City of Glenwood Springs does not currently have a dedicated source for funding for affordable housing. And so we've spent a lot of time getting creative with our zoning code and some policy changes, which I'll jump into right now. So where we are and where we were, I actually started with the city of Glenwood Springs in 2016 and have been their affordable housing person since that time. And this is just a snapshot of what we've been working on since then. And I'll get into these slides in specifics, but we've really, what I like to highlight is Glenwood Springs is constantly changing its code and tweaking the code to better fit the vision, better fit the community, finding the things that just aren't working for where we want to go. And so we're writing code all the time. Clark said that's not his jam, but it's mine. And on the horizon, we actually had a great night last night. We're working on a possible affordable housing tax question for the ballot, and we just got approval to move forward with Habitat for Humanity on 2 city-owned parcels. So we got a lot of moving parts. So let's jump into some of those aspects now. Our voluntary deed restriction program is an interesting one that we implemented in 2016, trying to incentivize a rental product. This is only for rental, so not for sale product. And it's a voluntary exchange. The city waiving all of our system improvement fees, which can range from $15,000 to about $22,000 per unit. In exchange for the developer basically implementing a rental cap, an average of 100% affordability for area median income on the units that are in the program. It's a 30-year timeline. It is voluntary, so a developer can exit out at any time and just pay back the amortized rate of the system improvement fees that were waived. So this has been a really interesting kind of first go for us at the incentive aspect. The results, we currently have 45 units in the program, and 2 of our major employers, Iron Mountain Hot Springs and the Adventure Park, as well as the Roaring Fork School District. You can see they have numerous units in the program. What we have found is that this really works well for those employers who have an incentive already to offer reduced rent to their employees, since we're seeing that as a very large challenge for our businesses, but not too much on the large development side. We haven't seen any of our larger apartment complexes jump in on this because it doesn't quite pencil out financially as beneficial for them. So we've seen some issues, but since 2016, we've gone into some other areas. So I'll go to the next slide. Following Laura on this is interesting because she had a point that said some communities were requiring as much as 1.25 spaces per unit. And I'm like, oh goodness. We did a complete development code rewrite in 2018. And as you can see under our old code, Laura, don't spit out your coffee, 2.4 spaces per unit was a requirement. And this is actually a project that got approved under that code with a variance. And what we were seeing is every housing project came in with a parking variance request. And this one was pretty contentious. They were granted the variance and they got down to a whopping 1.6 spaces per unit here at Six Canyons. And that was seen as, it was kind of mind blowing at the time. We rewrote the code. You can see now our base is 1.7 spaces per unit. With an allowance of a 30% administrative reduction. We did make that administrative if you are close to transit, so proximity to transit, shared parking configurations, compact parking. There's a list that if you meet, we can reduce that up to 30%. That would get it down to 1.2 spaces per unit. And that really has helped a lot of our housing development pencil out and do that configuration that Clark just walked you through. But getting down to 1.2 is a big ask, and it doesn't always go over well here. So parking is a political feasibility thing here on the Western Slope. Definitely slightly different from Denver, but I think we're looking at new ideas as well. One that I have on the horizon down there is lowering requirements for hotel conversions to residential. We're still seeing that huge barrier, and a lot of the hotels in town that want to be flipped and turn into residential are just not able to get there. So we've still got some crazy ideas up our sleeves. Next slide. Vacation rentals, hot topic for everyone, right? And luckily Glenwood Springs actually tackled this. We started back in 2018, and I'm so happy that we did, because I have not really had to look at this again during this much more pronounced crisis. But we did an overhaul and a very extensive and robust public engagement process to update our vacation rental policy. and our code. And you can see some of the components from before. We had a one-time $100 permit. So you paid $100, you could have your property be a vacation rental in perpetuity. There was no building inspections. We did have, they've never been permitted in accessory dwelling units, and they've never been transferable. So if a property sells that permit, someone has always had to try and get a new one. But with our old code, that was very easy to do. So really no limits on that. After this process, we obviously increased our fees considerably. Now they're $500 for the initial and $300 for renewal. We added back in building inspections, which are very important. We added some caps on multifamily units. And then really the one that I like to bring home that's made a huge difference for us is that 250-foot buffer. And so you cannot have one permit within 250 feet of another one. And what we've seen is some of our neighborhoods that were very dense on the vacation rental side with property sales have now gotten a lot less dense, specifically in our downtown area. And that's really helped us to get our permit numbers under control, and also get to the aspect of not one location is just, an entire block is not vacation rentals. My apologies that this slide is a little, looks like some overlapping, but the major takeaway here on our change is we had 134 permits in 2019, and you can see that was rapidly increasing on this chart here. So we were expecting that to continue. We implemented this new code, and now here in 2022, you can see that's dropped back down. We have 97 permits, and the program is working really well for us. And it seems to be working really well for the community. They're still allowed. We still have them. They're integral for our tourists, and they're great to use. But we've mitigated some of the negative impacts and made sure that we're not just getting endless vacation rentals into the future. So we have had a discussion on the use of permit fees for affordable housing, which is an interesting one for us now because we've actually reduced our number. So that amount using those fees is a smaller amount than would have been before. Next slide. We also did a major overhaul of our accessory dwelling units, and this was aimed at really trying to encourage more ADUs coming in. We had a lot of applications that were getting turned away because they didn't meet our code. And that was really challenging. So we did a review of this, and we made quite a few changes, increasing our maximum size up to 1,000 square feet, where previously it was 850. Also percentage, how big your ADU could be as a percentage of your primary dwelling. We increased that from 49 to 55, which doesn't seem like a huge percentage increase, but it really made a difference on the applications that we were seeing. And then also in that vein, adding a unit size exception for conversions that were happening inside of a house. No footprint increase. Someone was just taking their basement and turning it into an ADU. Which the 49% limit of primary dwelling and the 850 square foot size limit previously were really prohibitive to some of the ADUs we saw coming in. And then we also played around with our setbacks, which, as Clark showed you, can make a big difference for something penciling out and actually working. So this was, I think, back in 2020. And since then, we've had quite a few ADUs come in, but we've seen 5 accessory dwelling units come in that would previously not have been allowed. So we see that as a win, even though it's a small number. And final slide for me, the story of inclusionary zoning here in Glenwood Springs is a fun roller coaster. We had it previously, and then 2008, as we all knew, threw the housing market into a fun loop. And City of Glenwood Springs Council decided to remove our inclusionary housing requirements at that time. So from 2008 through 2016, it was still on the books and then finally got removed. So we didn't have anything there. Luckily, we picked it back up, and we have had that readopted in 2021. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the inclusionary zoning component. This is a more regulatory side of requiring developments to provide, I'm going to go with the word attainable housing in this case, because it's 100% area median income of what the deed restriction for affordability is limited to. So 10% of the units of any development over 10 units is required to provide these percentages for resident occupied, and then the actual affordable deed restricted component. And we set that to some occupancy requirements with a focus on a priority for people working within our city boundaries. So really looking to house our workforce. And then we have some additional tiers there that move out to the zip code and then 30 miles of the city limit. And one area I'd like to point out, and I think this is one of the areas we have a lot of room for improvement. When we were putting in this inclusionary zoning, we wanted something to address the density bonus aspect that we have been struggling with and trying to implement for a while. So we did add a couple sentences in there. We haven't had anyone use it yet, but addition of up to 1 unit in residential zones. And then we do have some lot standard flexibility as an incentive, except for parking. Laura's gonna frown at me, but we've got room for improvement. After seeing Laura's presentation, I've got so many ideas. So the results of this so far, this is a new program that we brought back. So these are all in the pipeline as approved project. Nothing has been built, but you can see this is rental and for sale. So we've got some there on the rental, and you can see the deed restricted component. And then the for sale product, which our community has been chasing really hard because we just haven't been getting that. So I'm excited that we're able to say we have 1 deed restricted for sale unit that's going to be coming online at 100% AMI sale price. That's been a lot of work there. And then on the horizon, because we're always changing, we're looking at changing those percentages. This is my last slide. We always have next steps, and then I've thrown in a couple lessons learned because I feel like that's the most important thing for us as jurisdictions to pass on to others, is like avoid this pitfall. So make sure moratoriums don't end before adoption. That was a fun one to learn in our vacation rental process. Community development was basically overrun with vacation rental applications for about a week. This is my personal motto. I've had to adopt. It's not going to be perfect. Adopt it and keep tweaking and learn from other people. Obviously, we've got a great team here today, so I've got some new ideas. And then finally, deed restriction language is important. I think a lot of people would share that sentiment. So happy to answer any questions on any of these programs. Glenwood Springs is not perfect, but we're certainly throwing our weight behind trying to solve our housing crisis, or at least make a small dent. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Hannah, and to all of our presenters today. We're just so fortunate to be joined by this panel of experts. I want to encourage you all to continue to submit questions via the Q&A function. We've got kind of a lineup of questions here that we've received as we move into the Q&A panel discussion portion. I was wondering if we could kick it off, sort of pivoting off of Hannah's lessons learned section there, with a question on, this can be anyone on the panel, some common roadblocks or mistakes that communities make when they are going about this process of they see the discrepancy, as many on this call have attested to. They see the discrepancy between their vision and their policy and zoning laws, and they say we need to go from A to B. What are some common roadblocks or common places where communities get stuck? And maybe we can just kind of mine out some of those lessons learned based on what we've seen in our work.
Y'all being shy?
Is that open to the panel?
It is. It is.
Oh, okay.
It is.
I'll
but
throw
maybe,
one out.
Go ahead, Clark. No, go for
Well,
it.
I was just going to say, one thing that we see, and I would imagine this happens in a lot of places, Hannah is not this way, but occasionally we'll be working with a community and you'll be surprised that the planning staff has often put in a lot of time in trying to do common sense things within their code that felt right at the time and so on. And, today it's not really working. And I would say very often when we talk to communities about policy barriers in their code that are not in alignment with what the broader vision emerging from the plan is, there is always there's usually like a planning director or somebody who's like, that's not true. Actually, it's just right. And it's been really cool. In fairness to those folks, they very often kind of come through and sort of realize it later and often really become champions of the reform. But I just want to note that if you're an elected official and somebody's like, this feels like it's out of sync with our vision and our policies aren't aligned, and you go and talk to the planning director, and I'm sorry to any planning directors out there that don't like to hear this, but you might get an answer that isn't really fully accurate. And I think it's useful. That's where I think it's useful to really go in and try to gut check in a real way, using a project on a real lot or a property, an experiment with what's actually possible, because we see that over and over again, where we start to feel like, oh, the community's ready to, the elected leadership's ready to look at some reform. And then you have staff be like, hey, hands off, this is our area and it's fine.
Clark, I'm going to jump in here. Like, I see this all the time, and I almost weekly, and it's just a flaw in how we set up local departments, honestly. I don't know how many times I see affordable housing positions sitting under planning departments, and I think it's really challenging. So I'm just going to call that out. So in New Mexico, I'm looking at a bunch of their stuff right now. They put their housing work with economic development. And the reason I say that, right, is because planning is regulating. It's not a bad thing. And Hannah, again, is like the exception to all of these rules. But there's just the purpose for planning functions is different than purposes for building lots of housing. They're gonna rub. So I think sometimes we need to just call that out and say, look, we're not going to completely align here. Given that, let's talk about it a different way. I also think neutral third parties coming in and helping to facilitate those conversations are really helpful. So I have a bunch of questions for Hannah. Matt, can I engage?
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah. So Hannah, I've been doing inclusionary zoning for 20 years, and it is so hard to do. So one of the big lessons we've learned in some of the work we've done is you can build really thoughtful policy, but if it's too complicated, nobody implements it right. So I'm curious how you're implementing your work in Glenwood. Is it all you? Do you have any partners helping? How hard is it?
Yeah, this has been really interesting, and I saw a question in chat that I answered. We're currently working on finalizing an agreement with Garfield County Housing Authority to run the program. Since we don't have anything that's out of the ground yet, it has been all in-house with our housing guidelines. It's made me nervous as far as trying to wrap my head around implementing this from the staff perspective, which we certainly don't have the capacity to do, especially when you get into those for sale units that require a lot more intense qualifications and lotteries and things of that nature. But, you know, there was a question of do we have a fee in lieu, which we removed because we saw from our previous inclusionary housing that that's where everyone went to. And I just found out that we actually have a chunk of not very much in our funds from the previous inclusionary housing. I was like, oh, okay, that looks like pre-development funds to me. But we took that out because we wanted to see the units actually coming in. And even though this is small, the results that I showed, we do have those units coming on. We've got our first for sale product, which is really what we're chasing. So that piece, you know, that we're seeing those units, that's actually exciting. We've got more units that have occurred in the last year. Granted, market is different than our inclusionary program did in its entirety, which only produced 10 previously. So hard to do. Yes. A little nerve-wracking. Absolutely worth it. I'm hoping so. Ask me in like another 2 years when we actually have these coming out of the ground and we have to manage them a little bit more.
And then there was a question in the chat related to your presentation as well about how were the employers involved? I love the incentive program. I think people are intrigued. And so, yeah, what did the employers do?
Yeah, that is an interesting program. We've got a lot of people asking us about it, and it's small, but I think it's robust. And it really is helping people who are looking at like our businesses who want to supply their employees, obviously, with rental cap and giving them just a little bit more financial incentive to make their project pencil out. So it's a waiver of fees. We're actually not putting, you know, cash funding into this. So there's no funding source outside of the city. But on your building permit, when you come in for a project of 10 units, we can possibly knock off $50,000 of it. And that it's a 30-year program, and that gets less and less if you back out of what you might owe back. But we have seen our employers be the ones that are super interested in that one, or someone building an accessory dwelling unit where $6,000 in fees, they just didn't know that that was going to come into play. And so we can waive that, get that accessory dwelling unit in. It's another affordable unit, well, attainable unit. And so it is a nice program. It's small. It might be able to make a huge difference in other places as well, depending on what the demand is and what businesses are doing.
So just to clarify, the employers are the developers. They're building the units.
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
So
perfect.
Iron Mountain Hot Springs, Roaring Fork School District. So the school district obviously has the incentive. They want to keep their teachers. They need affordable housing. So they wanted to go in on a development plan. We were able to help a little bit with those development costs.
You guys
Thanks.
have a program too that, just for clarification, there's a broader fee waiver program that the city developed for anybody that doesn't have to be employers that you can get, right, Anna? So you guys have that as well.
Yeah, it's the same program. It's not employer focused. Clark is one of our proud card carrying members on a small development. So you could be a, Bob and Tammy owning a single family home that wants to build an ADU. We can get your fees waived if you agree to limit that rent on your ADU.
So I'm curious, along those same lines, right? We're seeing more and more employers get involved, which I think is representing this move toward, it's a move toward innovative thinking, I think, in one respect, just due to the nature of the shortage that we're seeing in so many communities. What are, and this is again for the whole panel, go whatever direction with this, but what are some innovative or outside the box approaches that communities are adopting right now to address their housing needs?
I'll throw one more in and then let everyone else talk. One idea that we're toying with that has been in our Planning and Zoning Commission is the possibility of allowing 2 accessory dwelling units. I don't know how far we'll get with it, but it's definitely innovative and it creates a lot of feelings for people. And then also taking a look at Clark touched on this in his presentation, of making sure that we've got all of the housing choices, the housing options as use by right in all of our residential zones, and not making those conditional or special use permits, which adds entitlement time and process.
That's super interesting. Any other sort of emerging strategies or things that fall a bit outside the realm of our traditional approaches?
Well, I think the buy down programs that we're seeing are interesting in that they're just emerging in more and more places. And I think that'll be, I think where it's kind of interesting is sort of seeing the confluence between the work that people have been trying to do on the policy reform space for a while and pursuing the idea of like, man, if we just have more supply and diversity, we can create a more balanced market. And then and even before the pandemic, there was a reality that in some markets that just wasn't going to work and you couldn't build your way out of it. But I think certainly post-pandemic, the reality that a more aggressive approach is needed in many more markets than I think people realized. And we're sort of further down the chain of challengingness on this than people realize. And so now the question becomes, how do we go back and try to create long-term affordable units, both through new development and through existing stock? And I just think some of the programs that are out there that are trying to incentivize that, it's interesting to see a growing number of programs that are doing that through resident occupancy, so that you're sort of recognizing the impact of the more luxury market and saying, this isn't deeply affordable, but it is creating a secondary market for kind of locals only housing, which in the resort and amenity markets is a pretty big deal. And at least it starts to sort of bifurcate between, again, your luxury market and everybody else. And then the question is, how do we make sure as we do that, we also continue to create the diversity of more deeply affordable options as well? And so, I think those programs are kind of an interesting space. I didn't explain what they are. I'm guessing some people know on the call.
Clark, I was reading up on Eagle's program this morning, the Good Deeds program, I think the other thing that's kind of the intersection right now that we're struggling with is 10 years ago, if we built more product, we knew the market would kind of self-correct a little bit. We just knew that. But we don't even know what our markets are anymore, right? Like I had a market analyst come into Southwest Colorado and he said, your market's national, right? So it is so unknown right now what's going to happen in this crazy demand cycle we're in. But I think what a lot of communities are trying to solve for now is I have limited water. So even if I thought I could build my way out of it, I don't want to try, I don't want to take that gamble because I've only got X amount of taps, right? I've only got X amount of infrastructure capacity. And so I think we're going to see an uptick in hard set-asides again, because if we don't do that, we can't go backwards and fix this without like buying down hundreds of thousands per unit. So if anybody's got ideas on this or see any models. Or we'll have to create it, huh? It's kind of terrifying to me, like just the water stuff right now, so.
Yeah, we had a question from Trish along these same lines of innovation. Trish is asking about manufactured housing. How does that fit into planning for neighborhoods? You know, we're seeing the emergence in Colorado and several, I think I was reading in the Sun this morning that there's another modular factory that popped up out on the western slope near Grand Junction. So how do these modular homes fit in as we look at planning and zoning, where we know that sometimes those codes are going to conflict with this innovative product that can churn out units very quickly. So any thoughts on how modular housing fits into this discussion or manufacturing?
I know Laura's typing, so you should jump in, Laura.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Let me help you, Laura. Let me help you.
Great.
So this also came up yesterday, and we're doing a lot of community-wide strategy. And so this stuff comes up all the time. So we were interviewing a modular builder who wants to expand in our area. And we said, well, what's holding you back? And he named a bunch of things. He said, you know, it'd be really, really helpful is if you could get 3 or 4 of our plans, like fast-tracked, pre-approved, stamped, so that we didn't have any guesswork when we went through the entitlement process. And I was like, I think you could do that, but I don't know. Clark, could you do that? Could you have something like fast-tracked?
Well, that's a cool, so first of all, that's a cool idea. And there are places that are doing it, and they're doing it for different types. One of the places where we've sort of seen it, you know, you call it like permit-ready projects. And I think this is, we're talking to Silverton actually about this because they have such low capacity for planning and entitlement. And when people are like, the process is terrible, and they're like, we have one person, it's the county planner and the town planner, what are we supposed to do? So you're like, well, let's get really clear on what's allowed and what is a good fit, and basically almost make it sort of entitlement ready by saying, if you do this and build to these specs, like your project's, it's through the process. And so I think that's something, you know, I've seen that for accessory units and I've seen it for other types of projects. I haven't seen it yet for modular. And the modular, but I think that idea is an interesting one. I think the thing that's interesting about modular is just, one, people need to begin realizing that the technology has improved a lot. The capacity is improving. We lost a lot of construction capacity during the recession and we never got it back. And so as far as kind of increasing supply goes, modular is a place where we can do that. There's higher quality and more diversity in the type of product you can create there from in the past. And it includes everything from single family to really creative multifamily. And so, and the difference is, and is, you know, the time is money aspect of housing is you can get stuff built a lot faster. And so I think learning how to accommodate those types of projects is going to be really valuable. So that's my kind of 2 cents on that. We're both responding to your point and then also the more broad question about modular.
So I'd like to jump in if I can to talk a little bit about, it's not as sexy as modular housing, but another form of manufactured housing, which is, you know, like mobile homes. You know, I think our research has shown as an organization that, you know, mobile homes are a very important and big source of affordable housing, existing affordable housing in communities, but oftentimes they're under threat either because the zoning, you know, is sort of just specific to mobile homes and they get rezoned, and, you know, or sort of they're sort of viewed as prime areas for redevelopment as sort of an unwanted use. And I think that, you know, our organization, including this year, has run a number of bills to try to protect mobile home residents and sort of both the quality, but also the affordability of those mobile home parks. So I'd encourage you, when you're doing your neighborhood planning, not to sort of see those as necessarily like a blight or something that needs to be zoned out of your community, but potentially a strategy to help address your affordable housing needs.
So Glenwood, this is props to what's happening, and we're not quite there yet, right, Hannah? But Hannah and I have been working together on this sort of affordable housing fund opportunity in Glenwood, and we'll see if a tax measure gets put on the ballot and moves forward. But one of the things that the group was very clear about was ensuring that one of the potential uses for those funds could be to assist in the preservation of mobile home parks. And it's just such an incredible, those are some of the very best neighborhoods in our community. And that doesn't mean there aren't challenges with the ways that they're managed and administered, but and the price impacts that has for people. So there's certainly things we can do better. But you're so right. For so long, people looked at those and said, oh, there's a great development opportunity right there. And you look at it and you'd say, that's a neighborhood. And it'd be like, it's just a mobile home park. So Charlie, I think you're very well said.
We have 2 mobile home parks that have closed or in process of closing in Durango. So we had one last year. And I just kudos to La Plata County, because they just set up a housing trust fund and the first loan was to a mobile home park. So, but Charlie, we couldn't have done any of it, wouldn't have been on our radar if it wasn't for the legislation happening in 9 to 5. So those 2, and then we have some local organizers, but it's coming. We have 71 parks in our area. I think the next question we need to solve for, what are the local policies to slow down these processes? Yeah, I could go on and on about this, but we had Harmony come in and it was really nasty. So.
And we did, it was a timely discussion. SB 22-1287 passed its 3rd reading in the Senate this morning, which is going to provide residents some additional tools residents of mobile home parks who want to collectively purchase their park, which has become kind of the emerging best practice when we see that there's interest from an outside mobile home park investor. The residents can kind of collectively come together and say, we would prefer to raise the money and purchase the park ourselves and have it be kind of a self-managed community. So we'll be hearing more on that, I'm sure, in the coming weeks as that gets sent to the governor's desk, but just something worth mentioning, I think, in this discussion.
Yeah, and just a final plug. I know that ARPA funds are also being allocated towards community land ownership. And so one of those uses can be to purchase a mobile home park or to help community residents purchase their park. So lots of potential uses for that ARPA money.
Absolutely.
We do have a ton of questions that we're trying to organize around. One of the top questions, I think I haven't heard this yet, is, has anyone ever convinced an HOA or PUD to allow ADUs that were previously not allowed? Over half of Golden is PUD, and we can't even push for more density. So that, thanks for anybody who can comment.
We had some interesting things. Clark, you can follow up. We had some interesting things around PUDs and allowances with ADUs and also vacation rentals. And Glenwood Springs changed its code. I'm trying to recall the exact details since we change our code all the time. Previously, it stated if you didn't specifically list it as a use in your PUD, it was prohibited. And what we found with that is that's very challenging because maybe people weren't thinking about these things back when the PUD was formed. And so Glenwood Springs as a city changed our code and our policy. Unless you specifically prohibit it in your PUD, then it's allowed. And then we told all the PUDs and the HOAs, we got lots of phone calls, that if you want to have the conversation now and don't want these specific aspects, then you can change your covenants. But from the city's perspective, unless you have something specifically calling it out, we're going to move forward and say that it's allowed. So we had some of our HOAs change their covenants, but actually not many.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add is just that it speaks to the underlying challenge with having such bad zoning for so long that everybody started doing things through PUDs, and you end up in the kind of horse trading that goes along with that. And you know, that's basically how we did development in Colorado for like 20 years. And now we have these legacy challenges with that, just like, and Hannah, I didn't actually know that it happened, but that is the type of thing you want to be able to try to do. because fundamentally it just becomes it's, when you adopt that, it essentially becomes part of your zoning. And just like zoning, it's the devil's in the details. And if you can go in and say, no, it doesn't say you can't, then you probably have it sounds like you got the legal wherewithal that Hannah just described to do that. So, but you need to go in and make sure you're clear about that.
I'm not sure this was addressed completely, so I'm gonna kick it over to Laura. This has to do with if you can change parking or claw back some of the excessive parking that's out there. Can you build the developments on the periphery? And then this is my favorite, like in a suburban mall. And it made me think of our project in Aurora. But I was just thinking in general, is that also part of the strategy, not just to burden new projects, but do something with the existing?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. We haven't seen any examples that I'm aware of that kind of yet, just because this just went into effect, 11 months, not even 11 months ago. But I do think it's a conversation that we're having, and it's happening nationwide, right? I mean, a lot of jurisdictions are just getting rid of parking requirements altogether for housing, right? They're going to trust the folks that are building it to right size that parking, right? But I do think that it's a great question. And, I mean, I can geek out over, like, you look at parking and how it tears apart cities, and how once we got in our cars and all of the socioeconomic and cultural and environmental impact all of that has. And so I do think that it's an exciting prospect that we're talking about, as how do we create communities that serve the people within them? What does that really look like? And how do we look for creative solutions and places to build parking, place to build housing, not parking, geez. And so anyway, I think it's great. And I think it's something we need to constantly challenge ourselves about, because we need lots for housing. That's the solution to so many of our problems as a society. And so what are all the creative solutions for where that goes, right?
Awesome, Laura, thank you. I'm seeing a whole bunch of fun stuff around the new funds coming out. And I think that we've answered what we can, but I just want to see, I think what's happening, right? They passed the legislation, but there's a little bit of sausage making at Division of Housing and other DOLA. So I just had this conversation yesterday where somebody's like, well, how do you know that you can do that? I'm like, I really don't. Like, all I know is 20 years of precedent. So, and we all need to be paying attention, because there's probably going to be some public input around that sausage making. And we're going to want to put our 2 cents into what they can use the funds for. So I think more to come. Maybe, Matt, you could speak to, how do people track legislation? How do they find out what's going on and what happens next?
Sure. That can be kind of a bear, I'm not going to lie. I don't think that the state makes it particularly easy to keep track of everything that's going on, not to mention there's just a ton of moving parts. One thing I will say is we've committed to, as part of this series, and Charlie was kind enough to kind of take this on for this session, but as part of this series, we commit to touching on these bills as a part of every one of these sessions. So kind of letting you know, here's roughly where we are. Obviously, it's not going to be a comprehensive rundown. We could probably spend the entire session on legislation, but that is going to be covered. I think next time we convene, right, we'll have a good sense. The session is scheduled to end this Wednesday, so we'll have a good sense of kind of what has made it to the finish line. And we do anticipate that most of the bills that were related to that ARPA fund are going to become law. And so it's just a matter of how they are going to, as Jen noted, how that sausage is going to be made. We're going to see how they actually play out. One thing that I will, that helps me kind of keep track of it is I think particularly as it relates to housing, the Colorado Sun has done a really good job this year. They have a whole section of their newspaper dedicated to housing legislation. It lays out all the bills that are connected to ARPA and the recommendations of the task force. So if you want something that's just very digestible, high level, and just gives you an overview of what is happening, what's been passed, Colorado Sun housing section of their online newspaper, which is free to access, is the best resource that I've found.
Thanks, Matt. I think we've covered a lot of the questions. I think we're going to open and see if there's any others coming in through the chat or any other comments about this topic. Or and Monica, I think we just answered your question. We'll have a lot more details on the next session.
Awesome.
I actually had a quick question. Matt, you mentioned the mobile home park aspect that passed this morning. Is that the change that changed the timeline of what they had? I know it was 90 days for a response on the tenants for the mobile home. Did that get extended? I think it was 180.
Yeah, I'm going to have to verify, Hannah, where it finally landed because I wasn't able to tune into the floor work this morning. I believe what happened is the language in the original draft of the bill had that 90-day period extended to 180. There was an amendment that passed that reduced it to 120. So it's still an extension. It's perhaps not the extension that some of us who are on the advocacy side would have liked to have seen, but it is still an extension. We knew that that 90-day period to negotiate an offer was very, very limited.
Impossible. Well, fingers crossed. 120 is something, even though 180 would have been great. Thanks.
No, you're right. You're right, Matt. It is 120. So that's a bill that actually CCLP has been working on. So as we've been going, I've been getting little notifications about it. So it did pass with that amendment to lower it from 180 days to 120 days.
I have just an unrelated maybe comment that is sort of making sure we cover everything you need to cover when you're thinking about these things, which is all of these things are very political and require, elements of process. And the piece that we didn't touch that is probably like, you brought up the biggest barriers in the beginning, Matt, is how hard it is to actually get meaningful policy reform passed within the sort of political systems and dynamics we have. And, we should do a session, and you guys probably already have one, around how to do better processes that are more inclusive and elevate more people's voices. But I think it's really important to note that like the biggest thing that's killing housing in Colorado right now is political opposition from people that have their house already and have, sort of, they got theirs. And there's real challenges around privilege and access and inclusivity there that we want to be thinking about. And we've got to, when it comes to adopting these policies and you do the planning work, I feel this when we're working with a community, you do all the process, you do everything right, and everybody's involved. And then you get to the end and you sort of have the point of adoption and you get the people that show up. And we just had conversation of this nature yesterday, where there's fear about just the small number of folks that are going to show up, but that are the power brokers that get to make all the decisions. And you're like, that's not the way it works. And so I don't want to spend any time, more time than needed on the soapbox here, but it's just really important to recognize that within the land use and policy realm, that piece is one we need to figure out how to be much stronger in and do a much better job.
So Clark, thank you. Matt and I were just talking about this yesterday. There's a public will building session in 2 sessions. So the next one's on stabilization, homelessness. The session after that's on public will building. So if you have ideas, case studies, people that should speak, and definitely we want to hear from diverse voices in that one. We're just starting to think about that one. And that's for anybody who's on the session that has an idea about that. But when we interviewed, we got to do interviews with all the key sponsors for the series. Top 3 things they said to us: you need to talk about how to build will so we can do the right thing. And I was like, oh, that's powerful. And we know as an industry, that's something we've never been that great at. So thank you.
So a last minute question come in from our colleague in La Plata County asking about public transportation in rural areas. Any thoughts on public transportation policy in areas where we tend not to think about it as much, maybe?
Or innovative solutions. So we're talking a lot about privately funded, which I'm not sure it'll work, but.
I don't want to hog the mic time, but I have opinions. This is hard. I mean, we work in rural places, so maybe it makes sense that I chime in at least first. Or we work in a lot of rural places, and it's expensive, and some of it is the financial capacity to have a real rural system, a real effective rural transit system is pretty hard to pull off. And usually the ones that exist are, the way that they're funded, one way or another, whether it's equitable or not. I mean, you have sort of a demand center that helps fund it. So take the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority, RAFTA, the Aspen and Pitkin County help get that thing off the ground and kind of provide the financial wherewithal for it to be able to become a quasi, it is a regional transit authority, and a really good one, but it still doesn't reach everywhere. And so it's hard when it comes to housing, because the way that the market is solving our affordability problems right now, people are just driving further and further, and it's making very inequitable outcomes at the community level. And then to Laura's whole point, like the challenges we have of addressing parking in communities that are, rural or not. I mean, Glenwood's a city. We got urban context, but still, when everybody has to drive to get to work, and you don't have quite enough of a robust transit system to make it so that those multimodal options are there for everybody, you're just going to have to dedicate a lot of space to parking and a lot of money to parking. And so it's a pretty big challenge. It's why I put it into that section. And I think it's hard in rural places, especially rural places that don't have that kind of market magnet that can help undergird the financial startup of it. And so in those places, it really takes, it's hard. I think that's an unsatisfactory question, but it's hard in the really rural places to do meaningful transit that can support these things. But there are places that are trying to do it with sort of micro bus routes and things like that. But I think it's worth noting it's really, really expensive. So you're having to subsidize. And that's what I think maybe the point is. It's like, we have to realize that when we kind of grow the way that we grow, and we make it so that the affordable stuff's maybe way over there, it seems cheap when we do it, but it's like, it's going to cost money, because there's some point you're gonna be like, man, none of those people that work over there that are part of our workforce, they can't get into town now. We should probably send a bus over there. And so I don't know, I'll stop.
Well, I think part of it too is sort of really thinking about how you're aligning your land use with your transit system, or in preparation for a transit system. I think there's definitely certain levels of density at which transit just financially doesn't make sense unless you're whatever government or agency that's running it is prepared to heavily subsidize it. And so since here in the United States, we tend to see transit agencies more as businesses and public services, there really needs to be that sort of enough revenue generated by the transit system itself to be able to support the transit system's operations in most cases. And so, I think fundamentally it's sort of, thinking ahead about, as we're doing planning exercises or sort of visioning, thinking about, if people do want to see more transit, and I think being straightforward with them too, and upfront is, if you want to see more transit in the community, then it comes with certain other changes that we need to be thinking about as well to make sure that that investment in transit makes sense, and that, the land use that we're proposing is really going to be able to support the level of transit that the community would like to see in the future. I'll also just add really quickly that, particularly when we're thinking about affordable housing, we often just think about the housing cost itself. But I think to Clark's point about, where we locate affordable housing is incredibly important, because if, transportation costs can also add to sort of, the cost of housing, and can be a huge expense for many families, particularly if you have to drive everywhere. If you're already sort of a low income family and, your car breaks down, you need to fix it. That could be, the difference between, keeping your job or not potentially. And so I think, thinking about transportation and how people are going to get from home to work or to services, needs to be part of the conversation as well, because those transportation costs can add to the housing costs and potentially wipe out any of the savings that the family or household, gets from living in a subsidized unit.
There was one more thread in the chat or the Q&A that I think is really interesting, and it's about how many people can live in a unit. And I don't know, Laura or any of our Denver friends, if you can comment on the work you've done in Denver, but this is, I think, really critical to a lot of our cultural partners as well, who are struggling with some mismatch between traditional housing composition of households.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge struggle. White privileged folks have traditionally made all these rules about who's allowed to live in a house and how you have to be related by blood, and that's very focused on, a man and a woman and 2.5 kids, right? Like that's the base of so many of these this work. I was perfectly a part of the work to shift that and increase the number of individuals who can live in a house. And really thinking about like 4 roommates, right? Being able to live in a house. I mean, at one time, Brian and I were helping a friend who was leaving an abusive relationship. And when I looked at Denver code in this process, I realized we were breaking the law by letting our dear friend flee a violent situation, right? And so, you know, and for me, so much of it comes to, you know, who ends up having a say when we're making these changes, and reached huge resistance from folks who frankly don't want diversity in their neighborhoods, right? And so we really need to be thinking about the racial equity pieces of this, and how we're creating zoning and code that allows all types of families to thrive, and all types of folks who are in relationships to succeed, because I'm now not remembering how many folks not related are allowed to live in a house, but you know, we did 18 months of work, and at the end of the day really had to limit the number of folks who aren't related who are able to live in a house in Denver, just due to people's misconceptions, which was really challenging. So now it's 5 unrelated adults can live together in a house. And that allows, you know, like young nonprofiters to be able to share space together, to do good work that we desperately need in our city as well. But it didn't reach the kind of recommendations that were already a compromise the committee put forward.
And I think that's a great example of a policy that's in the zoning code, that was put in the zoning code in the 1950s and was still there. And, you know, while that was still there, society around it sort of changed and evolved. And I think, you know, there's a lot of things like that in potentially in your zoning code, if you haven't done a full rewrite of it, or even, you know, just rewrote certain parts of it, that, you know, may have made sense back in the 1950s when cultural norms were a little different. But, you know, when we think about today, you know, don't really make sense, or may sort of, you know, unintentionally, you know, make sort of a, you know, choices about, you know, multiple people living together for affordable, you know, reasons to make their rent cheaper, you know, that's illegal. And, you know, does that make sense, or is that sort of something that we want to change?
And we're in an era where it's not unheard of for what we would consider a very normal house in Denver to rent for something like $2,500, $3,000 a month. So if you are a college student or an early career, or even just, someone who's not, you know, raking in income, to be able to live in that house with a handful of roommates is really the only realistic way to live in the city. That's some of your only options. So,
you know, scaling that in some of the, I mean, so this is a challenge in another lens in some of the resort markets too, where you have a lot of seasonal demand, and a lot of J1 visas and things like that. And you have a lot of challenges in the influx of a bunch of people into the market, and it can't, you know, so I think one of the things we have to think about too is sort of a different type of product in certain markets that are really well designed specifically for this. So there's one thing to sort of say it's allowed and what's there, and then there's another to say, let's think creatively about what the sort of modern day boarding house looks like. It's safe and healthy and kind of provides some a different type of product for a different type of need. Because what happens right now is there's a lot of political pushback on that, as everybody's speaking to. And there too, like thinking about that within the context of parking, a lot of those people aren't going to need parking. So there's some cool considerations there. I think we've got a little distance to go till we're seeing some of those things built, just because of the political hurdles.
Well, Matt, you gonna bring us home?
sure, yeah, we will. We won't overstay our welcome on your Friday afternoon on this, what I hope is a gorgeous day for everyone throughout the state, as it is in the Denver area. Thank you all for joining us for session 3. Again, session 4 invites will go out next week, along with a link to this recording. And we just thank you all for giving of your time, and special thanks to our presenters for joining us from across the state today to offer their time and expertise. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, presenters. Have a great weekend.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Stay in touch.